Vesper had been reborn, brought back to the year 1983, lying in a hospital bed just after losing Evander Mercer's child. My sister-in-law is a widow raising a kid, and it isn't easy for her. Please try to cut her some slack, he had told her. The cup of brown sugar water he brought over was still steaming. In her previous life, she had swallowed her pride and endured it all, only to eventually be pushed down a flight of stairs by that good sister-in-law of his. But in this life, she ripped out her IV drip and threw the divorce papers right onto his military medals. "Let's get a divorce," she told him. "Consider the baby as the debt I've paid on your behalf to the Mercer family." The coppery metallic taste of blood still lingered in her throat. A cold, bone-chilling despair gripped every inch of her consciousness. The howling wind roared in her ears, accompanied by the horrifying, dry crunch of her bones shattering as her body slammed against the concrete floor. A short, agonizing scream tore through the chaos, violently yanking her back to the world of the living. Her eyelids felt as heavy as lead, but she forced them open just a crack. Her blurry vision was immediately overwhelmed by a blinding white light. The pungent smell of rubbing alcohol assaulted her nose, so overpowering that it made her nauseous. Deep inside her body, agonizing cramps twisted and tore at her internal organs, frantically clawing at her nerves. It wasn't the rigid, freezing sensation of falling from a tall building, but the harsh reality of a hospital bed. "You're awake," a flat, emotionless female voice sounded from above her. A nurse wearing a surgical mask was looking down, adjusting the speed of her IV drip with movements so brisk they felt almost completely apathetic. "The anesthesia wore off, so the pain is normal. You'll just have to tough it out. A miscarriage requires proper postpartum care, so don't take it lightly." She glanced at Vesper with an impassive expression, as if merely stating the most obvious fact in the world. Miscarriage. That single word felt like a red-hot branding iron pressed directly against her heart. "Hey guys, ever been forced to play the bigger person? Today, we follow Vesper. After losing everything to a toxic family, she gets a second chance. No drama, just an epic comeback. Let's dive in." The pain instantly sharpened, merging with the excruciating agony of being pushed off a building and having her body shattered in her past life. It all surged violently through her system. Her stomach churned, and she quickly turned her head, dry heaving into a chipped, white enamel basin beside the bed. But all she could bring up was a mouthful of bitter, sour fluid. Right at that moment, the pale green wooden door of the hospital room was gently pushed open. A tall, broad-shouldered figure blocked the light from the hallway, bringing a rush of cold air in from the outside. He was dressed in a crisp, olive-green military uniform, the star on his epaulets denoting his rank as a battalion commander, gleaming coldly under the fluorescent lights. It was Evander. He was holding a chipped white enamel mug, the rising steam blurring his sharp jawline. He walked over to the bed with very quiet footsteps and set the mug down on the small nightstand, making a soft, clinking sound. "It's good that you're awake," he said. His deep voice carried the steady, composed tone typical of a military man, yet it also betrayed an exhaustion he couldn't quite hide. He leaned forward, seemingly reaching out to touch her forehead. Almost instinctively, Vesper flinched and recoiled. Her back slammed hard against the cold, iron bed frame with a dull thud. The sudden movement sent a sharp stab of pain through her lower abdomen. She gasped, taking in a sharp breath of cold air as a cold sweat broke out on her forehead. Evander's hand froze in midair, and his thick, dark eyebrows knitted together in a slight frown. He pulled his hand back, his gaze sweeping over her face, which was as pale as a sheet of paper and drenched in cold sweat before finally resting on the steaming cup of brown sugar water. "Drink something warm," he said, picking up the mug and offering it to her. His tone was softer now, but it still carried an undeniably commanding reassurance meant to warm her up. The thick, reddish-brown liquid sloshed inside the white mug, giving off a sickly sweet smell. Vesper's gaze bypassed that nauseating cup of brown sugar water and locked onto Evander's face. This handsome, resolute face had once been the sole light of her youth. Yet, at this moment, every single feature clearly reflected the foolishness, blood, and tears of her past life. It was his sympathy, his widowed sister-in-law Evelyn, who didn't have it easy, that had ultimately pushed her into the abyss. In her previous life, on this exact same hospital bed, she had swallowed her agonizing, heart-wrenching pain and the despair of losing her child. She had drunk the entire cup of sugar water he brought her, only to listen to his profound words. "Vesper," Evander's voice rang out, deep and laced with his usual patience for preaching. Every single word was like a poison-tipped needle, piercing accurately into her already shattered heart. "I know you're upset. The baby is gone. and I'm hurting too. But Evelyn is a widow raising a child. Arthur passed away only a few months ago. Today, she was just panicked, so she lost her footing and bumped into you. His voice hesitated, as if weighing his words. His steady gaze locked onto her, carrying an invisible pressure that forced her to think of the bigger picture. She is a woman raising a small child alone. It really isn't easy for her. Please try to be a little understanding. Let's not make a scene, okay? Understanding? Make a scene? When she was pushed down the stairs by Evelyn in her past life, the woman's face had been twisted with jealousy. Evander had looked at Evelyn with unwavering trust as she cried and played the victim. And now, the cup of brown sugar water emitting a fake, sickly sweet scent, combined with the widowed sister-in-law Evelyn, who didn't have it easy, coming from his mouth. Snap. The string of reason in Vesper's mind abruptly broke beneath her towering hatred and freezing despair. All of her pretense, her endurance, the humiliation, and the bitter resentment accumulated from her previous life completely erupted at this moment, blazing into a destructive inferno that threatened to burn everything down. Understanding? Vesper suddenly raised her head. Her voice was as hoarse as sandpaper rubbing together, but it carried an ice-cold sharpness that stabbed straight at Evander. Battalion Commander Mercer, what exactly do you want me to be understanding about? Should I understand her accidentally bumping into me and making me lose our 3-month-old baby? Or should I be understanding of her status as a widowed mother, so she can brazenly steal my husband and take over my family? Her voice suddenly spiked, like a chipped knife tearing a piercing sound through the quiet hospital room. The patient in the next bed and their family members held their breath in shock. Even the nurse stopped what she was doing and stared at them in stunned silence. Evander's face darkened instantly, as if covered by a layer of frost. He clearly hadn't expected someone who had always been so obedient, perhaps even a bit weak like her, to suddenly explode. He certainly hadn't anticipated that she would tear away their veil of pretense so directly and sharply. His jaw clenched, and his eyes instantly turned sharp and cold, bearing the oppressive weight of a military officer. Vesper, mind your words. What do you mean steal your husband and take over your family? What kind of nonsense are you spouting? Evelyn and I are completely innocent. Innocent? Vesper felt like she had just heard the most ridiculous joke in the world. A broken laugh escaped her throat, and she couldn't stop the tears from flowing down her face, mixing with the cold sweat. If Evelyn was truly innocent, she wouldn't have been walking around the living room in the middle of the night wearing your dress shirt. She wouldn't have deliberately spilled the bowl of chicken soup I spent the entire afternoon simmering just to burn herself, only to turn around and cry while hugging Arthur's portrait for you to see. She wouldn't have taken advantage of my pregnancy, nagging in your ear day after day about how pitiful Charlie is without a father, and how evil and wicked of a stepmother I am. Vesper screamed it all out in one breath, every word carrying the bloody accusations and the bitter resentment of her previous life. In the hospital room, so quiet that one could hear a pin drop, only her heavy, panting breaths remained. Evander's face turned ashen. A storm of shock, furious indignation at being insulted, and a hint of poorly concealed panic swirled in his eyes. He suddenly took a step forward, his tall, imposing figure exuding a strong, oppressive presence. His voice, suppressing a thunderous rage, boomed. Vesper, you're crazy. Shut your mouth. How can you spout such nonsense? Do you even know? I don't know, she snapped fiercely, cutting him off. Her gaze, like a poison-laced blade, didn't back down in the slightest as she met his furious glare head-on. I only know that my baby is gone, killed by that good sister-in-law of yours who doesn't have it easy, and you, the father, are standing right here forcing me to be understanding and sympathetic toward her. Evander, where is your heart? Did a dog eat it? Or did a few of Evelyn's tears turn it to mush? You! Evander's entire body trembled, shaken by her directly calling him out and her fatal accusations. The blue veins on his forehead bulged prominently. He abruptly raised his hand, seemingly wanting to stop her hysterical outburst. The moment his hand went up, the last trace of warmth in Vesper's eyes completely extinguished. Enough. Wasting even one more second with this scum is an insult to life itself. All the outrage, the accusations, and the bitter unwillingness amidst her extreme hatred instantly collapsed, turning into a deadly, chilling void. She didn't even bother to spare him another glance. Her right hand shot up with lightning speed, grabbing the plastic IV tube sticking into the back of her left hand. Without a second of hesitation, her fingernails dug deep into her own flesh as she used all her strength to forcefully yank it out. Rip. The needle pulled out a trail of blood as it was brutally ripped from her pale veins. A distinct, bloody puncture mark instantly appeared on the back of her hand. Drops of bright red blood quickly seeped out, trailing down her pallid wrist and dripping onto the pristine white bedsheets, blooming like a blindingly vivid red winter plum blossom. A sharp pain hit her, but it was nothing compared to the agony in her heart. Evander's pupils shrank drastically at her sudden action. His hand, still raised in midair, went stiff. Vesper didn't give him any time to react. Her left hand threw off the thin blanket, which reeked of rubbing alcohol. The freezing air immediately enveloped her body, dressed only in a flimsy hospital gown. The cramping pain in her lower abdomen felt like steel blades churning inside her, and her legs were so weak she could barely stand. She bit down hard on her lower lip until she tasted the coppery tang of blood on her tongue. Relying on the clarity brought by that scent of blood, she used every ounce of her strength to stagger to her feet and step down from the cold iron bed. As her bare feet touched the freezing terrazzo floor, a bone-chilling cold shot straight from the soles of her feet to the top of her head. Her body swayed uncontrollably. "Vesper, what are you doing?" Evander finally reacted, roaring as he reached out to catch her. "Get lost!" she spat, violently slapping away his reaching hand. The force was so strong that she nearly lost her own balance. Her voice was hoarse and icy. Her eyes were glued to the left breast pocket of his military uniform. Clipped there was a Hero brand fountain pen that he treated as an absolute treasure. It was a gift from his old regimental commander after Evander had earned a major merit. Without a second thought, Vesper used her own blood-stained, trembling right hand, channeling all the strength she had left in her life, to plunge forcefully into the breast pocket of his uniform. Evander was caught completely off guard, never expecting her to suddenly attack. By the time she grabbed the cap of the fountain pen, his expression drastically changed. Instinctively, he tried to protect it, but it was too late. She yanked it out hard. Accompanied by the soft sound of tearing fabric, the heavy Hero fountain pen was ripped violently from his breast pocket. Grasped tightly in her hand, along with it, was a neatly folded piece of paper with slightly frayed edges. It was the divorce agreement she had written stroke by stroke the other night, under the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, enduring agonizing stomach cramps. Every single word on it was soaked in the blood and tears of her past life. Evander felt a sudden chill on his chest. He looked down at the tear on his uniform pocket, both shocked and furious, then snapped his head up. "Vesper, what crazy fit are you throwing? Give me back the pen." Vesper completely ignored his roaring. Her body ached so much it was almost convulsing, and cold sweat drenched the back of her hospital gown. Biting down hard on her lower lip, the metallic taste of blood flooded her mouth. Relying on the sliver of clarity that the scent of blood provided, she mustered all her strength to stand firm. Then, under Evander's shocked and furious gaze, and the stunned eyes of the patient in the next bed, she raised her hand high, the hand clutching the fountain pen and the blood-stained divorce papers. Using the last remnants of her strength, carrying the bone-shattering, flesh-tearing hatred of her previous life and the resolute coldness of this one, she slammed it hard against the star emblem on his epaulet, the symbol of Evander's glory as a battalion commander. Smack! A crisp yet dull sound of impact exploded in the dead-silent hospital room. The cold metal of the insignia stung the palm of her hand. The sturdy cap of the fountain pen, separated only by the thin divorce paper, struck heavily against the shining star. Evander's tall, imposing frame was shaken by this sudden, forceful blow, causing him to involuntarily stagger half a step backward. All the anger on his face instantly froze, turning into a blank, stunned expression. He looked at her in disbelief, as if he were seeing the pale, frail woman before him for the very first time. Vesper panted heavily. Cramps continuously washed over her lower abdomen, and her vision darkened, but she still straightened her back, even though her spine was trembling from the pain. She raised her head to meet his bewildered gaze. Her face was completely devoid of expression, leaving only a chilling stillness like dead water. Her lips quivered from blood loss and agony, yet her voice remained clear, enunciating every single word, each one like an ice-coated nail. "Evander, let's get a divorce." She pressed the crumpled, blood-stained divorce paper in the palm of her hand firmly against his cold epaulet, as if wanting to nail it straight into his flesh and blood. As for this baby, her gaze swept over her flat but still aching lower abdomen, a place that had once nurtured a tiny life but was now left with only cold emptiness and a bone-deep hatred. Her voice suddenly soared, carrying a ruthless sharpness and a liberated mockery. "Consider it as the debt I've paid on your behalf to the Mercer family." The moment she finished speaking, she forcefully withdrew her hand, tightly gripping the cold Hero fountain pen in her palm. Her knuckles turned stark white from the exertion. Without taking another look at Evander's complicated expressiona, mix of shock, anger, and a hint of bewilderment, she turned around. Leaning against the cold wall, she took it one step at a time, carrying her body full of pain and sheer resolve toward the door of the hospital room. The back of her thin hospital gown was soaked in cold sweat, clearly revealing her gaunt shoulder blades that looked like broken butterfly wings. Behind her was a deathly silence. Only her heavy, suppressed panting and the scuffing sound of her slippers dragging against the floor remained. Evander stood frozen in place. The torn strip of fabric on his uniform pocket swayed, and on the epaulet bearing the star insignia, it seemed as though the indentation of the paper and a glaring smear of dark red still lingered. He looked down at the crumpled paper wedged tightly into the crevice of his epaulet. The words, "divorce agreement," were like a red-hot branding iron, searing his eyes with pain. He abruptly raised his head, staring at her frail back as she leaned against the wall, struggling to move toward the door. A surge of tremendous fury at being deeply insulted, coupled with an unnamed panic, rushed in and consumed him. How dare she? How dare she be so absolute? This had to be words spoken in anger, an impulsive outburst from the agony of losing her child. "Vesper!" he roared like an enraged lion. Taking a long stride forward, his large hand grabbed her arm with an irresistible force. That hand was like a vice, clamping down tightly on her slender arm with such strength that it felt like he might crush her bones. The immense strength, carrying his familiar, domineering possessiveness, forcefully spun her around. "Have you made enough of a scene?" His voice, suppressing a thunderous rage, exploded in her ear. His scorching breath brushed against her neck, carrying a mixed scent of gunpowder and tobacco. "Get back in bed right now." "Divorce? Do you even know what kind of nonsense you're spouting?" The severe pain shooting from her arm and the agonizing cramps in her lower abdomen intertwined, making her vision go dark to the point where she almost passed out. The humiliation from her past life being consoled by him, being constantly told to be understanding time and time again, rushed back like a torrential flood. It all ultimately turned into the boundless, freezing cold she had felt when falling from that building. Hatred, a towering hatred, like erupting magma, instantly crushed all her physical pain. "Let go," she hissed through gritted teeth, her voice hoarse and icy, carrying the ferocity of a dying beast. She didn't look back. She just abruptly thrashed, using all her life's strength to shake off his iron grip. "Evander, let her go, damn it." A thunderous roar came from the door of the hospital room. A man wearing faded work coveralls, built like a tower, and rushing in like an enraged, red-eyed bull, charged inside. It was Wyatt, her older brother. He had just gotten off the night shift at the factory and had rushed over the moment he received the news from a neighbor. The moment he stepped through the door, he witnessed a scene that made his eyes almost split open with fury. His little sister, who had just lost her baby, was being grabbed like a chicken by that high and mighty battalion commander brother-in-law of his. Her face was as pale as a sheet of paper, looking like she was on the verge of collapsing. Wyatt's roar was like a thunderclap right by the ear, shaking the entire hospital room. Without wasting another word, he closed the distance in 2 strides. His hand, as large as a palm leaf fan, brought a rushing gust of wind as he threw a heavy punch right at the arm Evander was using to hold her. The movement was fast and powerful, carrying the raw roughness typical of the working class and a desperate, protective instinct for his sister that disregarded everything else. A dull thud of flesh meeting flesh rang out. Evander, being a military man, had extremely fast reflexes. The moment Wyatt's fist came crashing down, he instinctively loosened his grip on Vesper and raised his arm to block, deflecting more than half of the force. But Wyatt's rage-filled punch was too heavy. Blocking it so hastily, Evander still felt the shock numb his arm, and his tall frame involuntarily staggered backward. However, in this split-second opportunity, Vesper, like a slippery fish, suddenly broke free from his hold, and finally, her body completely lost its balance. Her body went limp, falling backward. Vesper, Wyatt, quick-eyed and quick-handed, ignored settling the score with Evander for the moment. He lunged forward in a single bound, using his broad chest and sturdy arms to catch her safely. The familiar scent of machine oil and sweat enveloped Harriet was the scent of her older brother. In her previous life, when Evelyn had driven her into a corner, it was her brother who had secretly stuffed the food stamps and the few pennies he had saved into her hands, telling her to run away. But in the end, she hadn't managed to escape. What had happened to her brother after that? It seemed she didn't even know. A massive wave of sorrow and the immense grievance of a disaster survivor surged up her nose, blurring her vision. She clutched tightly at the rough fabric of her brother's work clothes like grasping at a final lifeline. until a suppressed, broken sob finally escaped her throat. "Don't be afraid. I'm here. I'm right here," Wyatt said, holding her. Feeling the violent trembling of her fragile body and hearing his little sister's muffled cries, his heart felt like it was shattering. He abruptly raised his head. His bloodshot eyes, like two red-hot blades, fiercely pierced toward Evander, who was standing a few steps away with an ashen face. His voice was so hoarse from anger that it was almost distorted. "Evander, are you even human? My sister just suffered such a massive ordeal and lost her child. It's bad enough you didn't protect her properly, but now you're putting your hands on her? Are those military medals of yours meant for bullying the women in your own home?" Evander's face was so dark it looked as though water might drip from it. He rubbed his arm, which was still stinging from Wyatt's punch. The insignia on his epaulet emitted a cold gleam under the lights. He looked at his wife, who was trembling in Wyatt's arms, yet whose eyes were bone-chillingly cold. Then he looked at his brother-in-law, who was protecting his sister like an enraged lion. A tremendous sense of grievance and a fury with nowhere to vent violently clashed in his chest. "I didn't put my hands on her." Evander's voice lowered, carrying the rigidity of a military man and a hint of frustration at being wronged. She ripped out her IV and tried to leave on her own. "I was only what?" Wyatt completely ignored his explanation, standing like a solid wall in front of Vesper, his eyes wide with anger. "Only holding her back? Bullshit. Battalion Commander Mercer, look at my sister's wrist. Look at the blood on her hand, and look at the color of her face." The more he spoke, the angrier he got, his chest heaving violently. "What did my sister ever get from marrying you, huh? Did she benefit from your high rank? From your generous allowance? She stayed up late and woke up early to take care of that household of yours. To take care of that widowed sister-in-law who doesn't have it easy. Now her baby is gone, and she almost lost her own life along with it. And you're still here forcing her to be understanding of others? Understanding my ass? Evander, did a dog eat your conscience?" Wyatt's roaring was like a barrage of machine gun fire. Every single word smashed directly into Evander's face, as well as into the hearts of everyone in the hospital room. The patient in the neighboring bed and their family members looked at Evander with changed eyes, their gazes filled with contempt. Evander was scolded to the point where his face turned alternately red and pale. The blue veins on his forehead throbbed. He clenched his fists tightly. His military pride simply couldn't tolerate being publicly reprimanded like this, especially being accused of mistreating his wife. He wanted to retort. He wanted to say that he had never mistreated Vesper. He had provided her with a comfortable life. He only hoped for family harmony. He hoped she could be understanding of Evelyn's difficulties. But when his gaze met her cold, empty eye-size filled with hatred and detachment nestled in Wyatt's embrace, all his justifications choked in his throat. Those eyes were like two bottomless pools of freezing water. Swirling inside those eyes were emotions completely alien to him, causing an inexplicable chill to rise within his heart. Right at that moment, a deliberately lowered female voice, laced with sobs, rang out from the door of the hospital room, carrying just the right amount of frailty and panic. "Evander, what's going on with Vesper?" I heard Vesper woke up, so I specially made some millet porridge to bring over." It was Evelyn. She was wearing an old, small floral print padded jacket, her hair neatly combed. Her face bore a perfectly measured expression of worry and paleness. Carrying an aluminum tiffin carrier in her hand, she stood timidly at the door. Her gaze swept over the tense atmosphere in the room before finally landing on Evander. Her eyes immediately turned red, and her voice became tearful. "Evander, are you okay? It's all my fault. It's all because I'm no good. If I hadn't lost my footing this morning, this wouldn't have—" "Evelyn," Evander interrupted her self-blame immediately, as if he had found an emotional crutch or desperately wanted to escape this awkward situation. His voice unconsciously softened. "It has nothing to do with you. You didn't mean to do it." He took a step forward, seemingly intending to take the tiffin carrier from her hand. "Didn't mean to?" Vesper, who had been silently curled up in her brother's arms, suddenly raised her head. Her voice wasn't loud. It was even a bit weak. But like an ice-coated needle, it pierced right through the fake warmth of the hospital room. Everyone's gaze instantly locked onto her. She looked at Evelyn's face, so full of innocence and self-blame, but she saw right through to the fleeting smugness and calculation hidden deep in the woman's eyes. In her previous life, it was this exact face that always played the weak and helpless victim in front of Evander, yet was as vicious as a viper in front of her. It was this woman who had personally pushed her off the rooftop, a cold hatred, like a poisonous vine, instantly coiled tightly around her heart, nearly suffocating her. Evelyn, Vesper said, looking at her. The corners of her mouth slowly curled up into an icy arc. There was no warmth in that smile-only bone-deep mockery, and the chilling clarity of someone who saw through everything. Behind the picture frame of your late husband, Arthur, there's a roll of food stamps tied with a red string, along with $5. That was the allowance Evander sent back for me to buy nourishing food last month, wasn't it? Her words weren't loud, but they struck like a bolt of lightning right on Evelyn's head. The worry and paleness on her face vanished without a trace in an instant, replaced by an ashen gray like dead embers. The hand holding the tiffin carrier began to tremble violently. With a loud clatter, the aluminum container hit the floor. The piping hot millet porridge spilled out, splashing all over her feet. Like a cat whose tail had been stepped on, she shrieked. "You're speaking nonsense. You're spitting blood and slandering me. I didn't do it. Evander, she's framing me." Her reaction was too intense, too abnormal. In a flash, it completely exposed her guilty conscience. Evander's hand, which had been reaching out to take the tiffin carrier, froze in midair. He suddenly turned his head, looking in shock at Evelyn, who was shrieking out of control, and then looked back at Vesper with eyes full of disbelief. Food stamps? Allowance? The money and stamps he sent back every month, Vesper had never once mentioned it wasn't enough. Could it be? An incredibly absurd thought surged up uncontrollably, sending a cold shiver down his spine. Whether I'm slandering you or not, a quick search will reveal the truth. Vesper leaned against her brother's chest. Her voice was weak, but her gaze was as sharp as a knife, pinned directly onto Evelyn's face, which was now twisting in fear. Inside the biscuit tin covered in red paper at the bottom of the wardrobe in your bedroom, besides more food stamps, there's also a Plum Blossom brand watch. That was the dowry my mother left for me. Evelyn, do you dare let someone go and search your room? Thud. As if all her strength had been drained, Evelyn's legs gave out. Her entire body collapsed into the puddle of spilled porridge, shaking violently like a leaf in the wind. Her lips trembled, unable to utter a single word. That look of horrified despair had completely betrayed her. The evidence was irrefutable. The hospital room fell dead silent, leaving only Evelyn's heavy, desperate panting. Evander was like a petrified statue, rooted to the spot. He looked at Evelyn collapsed on the floor, her face drained of all color, and then looked back at his wife in her brother's armchair, eyes cold and weak, yet seemingly seeing right through everything. The epaulette on his chest felt cold and rigid. The divorce paper he unconsciously gripped tightly in his hand rubbed against his palm. All the understanding, all the claims of not having it easy at this very moment, were brutally and bloodily torn apart, exposing the most filthy and malicious calculation underneath. Wyatt held Vesper tightly. Looking at Evelyn on the ground and Evander standing frozen, he let out a cold, contemptuous snort through his gritted teeth. Pfft, a whole family of bastards. He didn't spare them another glance. Carefully supporting Vesper as if protecting a fragile treasure, his voice was incredibly gentle. "Vesper, I'm taking you away. We're not staying in this hellhole anymore." Vesper nodded weakly, burying her face into the crook of her brother's shoulder, which smelled strongly of machine oil. She tiredly closed her eyes. Her body was numb with pain, but her heart was chillingly calm. Evander stood in place, watching helplessly as Wyatt half-supported, half-carried her out of the hospital room, taking difficult but incredibly resolute steps. That thin back disappeared into the light outside the door, like a ruthless dividing line. Evander looked down and opened his hand. In his palm rested the crumpled divorce paper, stained with dark red blood, and a cold epaulette button that still lingered with the warmth of her fingertips. That desperate, full-force blow from earlier had knocked the button loose. The cold metal rubbing against his palm made him feel a bone-deep chill. Outside the window, it was already late autumn of 1983. The gray sky pressed heavily upon the city. Wyatt pedaled an old Phoenix Bicyclia rickety thing where everything rattled except the bell. On the weak back seat rested the thick padded jacket he had just taken off, still carrying the scent of his sweat, as he carefully gave Vesper a ride, bumping along the pothole-filled roads of the factory district. He didn't take her back to the military compound that reeked of the despicable Evelyn, but headed straight to the low-slung, dilapidated row houses behind the textile factory. Wyatt's home was a red brick house of less than 100 square feet, its walls blackened by coal smoke, the entrance stacked with honeycomb coal briquettes and chopped firewood. "Vesper, we're home. Mind the doorstep," Wyatt said as he parked the bike. His movements were so gentle, they were almost clumsy as he lifted her down from the back seat, as if cradling a fragile porcelain doll. The house was cramped but kept quite tidy. It had an old wooden bed, a square table with peeling paint, and 2 stools. The air was filled with the smell of coal smoke and the scent of a single man living alone. It was a bit stifling, but it brought a strange sense of security. "Wyatt, you live here. What about my sister-in-law?" Vesper asked weakly, leaning against the headboard and covered with an old, patched but freshly washed cotton quilt her brother had dug out. "Don't mention her." Wyatt, who was squatting on the floor poking at the coal stove, didn't even turn his head. His tone was stiff. "I divorced that gold digger a long time ago. It's just me in this house, nice and quiet. You just rest easy here and recover. That's all that matters." The fire in the stove flared up from his poking. The dancing orange flames chased away the late autumn chill. He didn't ask anything else about what happened at the hospital, nor did he mention a single word about Evander or Evelyn. He just quietly stoked the fire, then rummaged through the cabinets and chests, pulling out half a bag of noodles, 2 eggs, and a slightly hardened piece of pork fat hidden in a tin. "Eat this for now. Tomorrow, I'll go to the grocery store and see if I can buy some meat." Wyatt brought a bowl of clear noodle soup with a poached egg and a layer of fat floating on top, placing it in front of Vesper. His rough fingers awkwardly wiped against his faded work pants. The steam from the bowl of noodles made her eyes sting. In her previous life, when Evander had demanded she be understanding of Evelyn, and she was huddled by a cold stove gnawing on a cold steamed bun, had her brother also been in some corner like this, worrying about his useless little sister? "Wyatt." Her throat felt slightly bitter. "Eat," Wyatt commanded, allowing no room for refusal as he stuffed a pair of chopsticks into her hands. "Don't think about anything. Even if the sky falls, I'm here to take care of you." The days passed slowly and with difficulty. Amidst the crackling of the coal stove and the warmth of the noodle soup, the physical wounds on her body gradually healed, but the giant, gaping hole gouged into her heart was still constantly battered by freezing winds, day and night. A few days later, an unexpected person knocked on the door. It was Tommy, Evander's liaison officer. The young man looked awkward and sympathetic, holding a craft paper document envelope in his hands. "Sisterin, Comrade Vesper." He quickly changed how he addressed her, his voice lowering. "The Battalion Commander, Battalion Commander Mercer, asked me to bring this over. He said please take a look." Vesper leaned against the headboard. Her face was still pale, but her eyes were as calm as still water. She signaled for her brother to take it. Inside the envelope was the exact divorce agreement she had slammed onto Evander's epaulette. Only this time, beneath the agreement, there was an additional line written in fountain pen strokes, forceful yet filled with hesitation and reluctance. "Comrade Vesper, I have received the report. This is a serious matter and cannot be decided in a moment of anger. I hope you will calmly reconsider and take care of your health. Once you recover, we will discuss this again." Evander. Discuss? Vesper curled her lips, revealing a cold, mocking smile. Did he think she was still the Vesper from her past life? The one he could mold as he pleased? The one who could be fooled by a few words about being understanding? These words still carried his condescending, commanding tone. It was a stalling tactic, firmly believing that she would eventually yield and come back to him. He didn't even mention Evelyn, not a single word. It was as if the public exposure in the hospital room had been nothing but a nightmare. "Wyatt?" Vesper's voice was very soft, but filled with an unshakable resolve. "Could you get me a pen and paper?" Wyatt immediately found her a crumpled piece of notebook paper and a stub of a pencil. Vesper struggled to sit up. The pencil tip glided across the paper with a scratching sound. She didn't write a single extra word. She simply drew 2 heavy lines beneath Evander's paragraph, then used all her strength to write down 2 icy, resolute words. "Divorce. Immediately." She folded the paper, stuffed it back into the envelope, and handed it to Tommy. "Tommy, please bring this back exactly as it is for me." Tommy looked at the 2 words deeply indented into the paper. His throat bobbed, but in the end, he didn't say anything. He gave a quick salute, turned around, and left. Back at Evander's office on the base, Evander stared intently at the paper from the envelope. Those bold, sharp, dark words, "divorce. Immediately." Were like red-hot awls stabbing fiercely into his eyes. A nameless rage, mixed with an indescribable frustration, shot straight to the top of his head. Irritated, he yanked open the collar of his military uniform and paced back and forth in the cramped office. How dare she? Why had she become so unreasonable? The baby was gone, and he was heartbroken too. Evelyn had done wrong by stealing, yes, but she was so scared she had fallen ill, and she had already admitted her fault. Couldn't Vesper give her a chance to make amends, for the sake of a martyr's family, for the sake of giving him, Evander, some face? Since when had Vesper become so cold-blooded and petty? Divorce? If she left him, a woman who had just suffered a miscarriage and carried the stigma of a divorcee, how would she survive in this day and age? She had truly lost her mind to anger. Battalion commander. Tommy spoke up cautiously. Comrade Vesper looked very weak, but her attitude was extremely resolute. Tommy added cautiously. Evander spun around, his eyes sharp. Resolute? She's just being foolish, being instigated by someone else. The furious face of Wyatt flashed through his mind. It had to be that brute pulling the strings behind the scenes. He waved his hand in frustration. Leave this matter alone for now. Wait until she recovers and calms down, then we'll figure it out. He threw the divorce paper with Vesper's cold response into the bottom drawer. Subconsciously, he still didn't believe rather, he didn't want to believe that Vesper, who used to consider him her entire world, could be so utterly heartless. Back at the military compound, Evelyn had indeed fallen ill. Ever since the day she was exposed in front of everyone at the hospital, she had holed herself up in the house. Her face was sallow, her eyes were filled with panic, and she would occasionally hug Arthur's portrait and shed tears. Evander was furious with her, but seeing her in this state reminded him of his fallen comrade. That anger choked in his throat, ultimately turning into a heavy sigh. He sternly reprimanded her, forced her to return the stolen items, and simultaneously cut off several months of her living allowance. Evelyn tearfully agreed, appearing incredibly remorseful. However, when Evander once again threw Vesper's demand for an immediate divorce onto the table out of sheer frustration, Evelyn accidentally saw it while coming in to pour water. Beneath her lowered eyelashes, a venomous, snake-like glint flashed. Her opportunity had arrived. She understood Evander all too well. This man valued loyalty and affection, but he valued his pride even more, especially his military honor and the stability of his family. Vesper was now completely unyielding, turning a deaf ear to him, and even dragging Evelyn's dirty laundry out into the open. Evander was delaying the divorce for 3 reasons. First, he believed Vesper wouldn't survive well without him. Second, he was afraid the matter would blow up and cause a bad impression. And third, there was perhaps a lingering sense of unwillingness and a rejected desire for control that he himself didn't even realize. But as for this fire of a bad impression, Evelyn knew she could certainly fan it to make it burn much fiercer. A few days later, a rumor, like a venomous bug sprouting wings, quietly spread throughout the military compound. The core of the rumor was extremely vicious. It claimed that Vesper had long been keeping a lover at the textile factory, a widowed technician. She had purposely lost the baby this time, specifically to get a divorce and elope with that wild man. Battalion Commander Mercer had been cuckolded. This rumor was woven in an incredibly believable way. The fact that Vesper worked at the textile factory was true, and there really was a single technician working there. Her sudden, adamant demand for a divorce was already considered highly abnormal under traditional views. In an instant, the military families who didn't know the truth looked at Evander with sympathetic eyes and began whispering behind his back. Evander was summoned to the political commissar's office. Commissar Lee, a stern revolutionary veteran, tapped his desk, his voice heavy. Comrade Evander, in principle, the organization does not interfere with your family matters, but right now, the impact is very bad. There's the issue with Comrade Vesper, and that situation with Evelyn. What exactly is going on? Right now, the rumors outside are very ugly, saying all sorts of things. This is a massive detriment to your personal reputation and the honor of the military. Evander's face was deathly pale, his fists clenched so tightly they cracked. He had, of course, heard those filthy rumors too. Initially, he felt sheer fury, a hatred so deep he wished he could drag the rumor monger out and shoot them. But after the anger subsided, a darker thought entangled him like a poisonous vine. Vesper was so desperate for a divorce, disregarding absolutely everything. Could it be? Could there really be some hidden truth he didn't know about? That technician, the seed of doubt, once sown and watered by rumors, instantly sprouted into a twisted, poisonous tree. The hesitation and complex emotions, the lingering guilt he felt toward Vesper were instantly reduced to ashes by a towering inferno of rage and the sheer humiliation of his masculine pride being trampled. Especially when Commissar Lee sternly pointed out that personal conduct issues would directly affect his promotion evaluations, the final string of Evander's reason completely snapped. Commissar, Evander stood up abruptly, his chest heaving violently. His voice was hoarse, carrying the agony of betrayal and a ruthless finality. It is my failure to manage my family properly that has brought shame to the command. I request command's approval for my divorce from Vesper. As for Evelyn, it is true that she stole those items. I will deal with her strictly and force her to move out of the military compound. Please trust in my integrity as an officer. I absolutely will not let personal matters affect my duties. At this moment, considerations for his future, the fury of being betrayed, the massive pressure from the rumors, and the complete severing of whatever lingering affection he had for Vesper, who had become a resolute stranger, crushed everything else. He chose to sever the ties with one clean cut, opting to protect his face and his military career. As for the truth, in the face of surging malice and immense pressure, it was no longer important. Subconsciously, he even needed to believe that rumor to make his decision to agree to the divorce seem less humiliating and passive. At the textile factory's residential quarters, Evander appeared wearing a crisp military uniform, his face as gloomy as the sky before a storm. He was holding the officially approved divorce papers and a thin property division agreement. Vesper wasn't surprised in the slightest. She didn't even let him into the house, opting to stand right at the doorway. The late autumn wind blew the stray hairs across her forehead, making her already pale face seem even colder. She calmly accepted the documents. Her gaze swept over the bright red stamp and Evander's flamboyant signature, which was pressed so deeply into the paper it carried a forceful anger, as if he were venting his rage. Vesper, Evander's voice was dry and tense. He looked at her with complex eyes containing lingering anger, scrutiny, and perhaps a poorly concealed agony that he himself refused to acknowledge. Take care of yourself. He wanted to ask about that technician, but ultimately, his military pride and his disdain for such filthy topics kept him silent. He had already assumed her impurity, which made his decision to agree to the divorce look much more justified. Vesper raised her eyes and looked at him quietly. Her gaze was clear and cold, like a bottomless pool of freezing water, vividly reflecting Evander's forced anger and hidden bewilderment. At this moment, it also reflected the figure hiding around the corner of the wall behind him, peeking out with a face full of smugness, Evelyn. So that was it. The corners of Vesper's mouth curled up incredibly slowly into a small arc. It wasn't a smile, but the chilling clarity of someone who saw through everything, carrying endless mockery and an ultimate sense of liberation. She didn't bother to give Evander another glance, nor did she pay any mind to his meaningless, final "take care of yourself." Right in front of him, she simply folded the divorce papers carefully and tucked them into her breast pocket, keeping them close to her body. The cold paper pressed against her chest like a block of ice that had finally melted. Then, she turned around. Her thin back was ramrod straight as she stepped without hesitation through the doorway behind her, which radiated the warm, golden, simple yet steady glow of a coal stove from within the small house. With a soft click, the door closed shut. Outside that door, it was late autumn of 1983. Under the gray sky, Evander's figure stood frozen in the biting wind, separated by that door into an entirely different world, left alone with the unconcealable, malicious, and smug smile of Evelyn lurking around the corner. Inside the door, the fire in the stove crackled. Vesper leaned against the wooden door and slowly slid down to sit on the floor. She closed her eyes. 2 streams of hot tears finally broke through their icy dam, pouring out and surging forward to wash away the bloody filth of her past life and the humiliation of this one. The piece of paper, light as a feather in her hand, now felt as heavy as 1,000 pounds. The shackles were broken, the debt was paid. A new life belonging to Vesper truly began at this very moment. The wind howling outside the window sounded as if it were singing an elegy for a past that had completely died, while simultaneously playing the prelude for a soul rising from the ashes. During the day, Wyatt sweated profusely at the machinery factory. The moment his shift ended, he would dive headfirst into the kitchen, clumsily figuring out how to turn their limited food and cooking oil stamps into nutritious meals. He somehow managed to find a small packet of brown sugar and persistently brewed her a bowl of it every single day. He also asked his factory friends to trade for some eggs at the black market. He couldn't bear to eat a single one himself. He boiled them all and hid them at the bottom of her bowl. Once her body had recovered enough to move around a little, Vesper began to clean up the small house. At the bottom of an old, dusty wooden trunk stuffed with old newspapers and miscellaneous items, she uncovered a heavy, small bundle wrapped in blue cloth. Unwrapping the blue fabric, she found a few old books with yellowed pages and curled corners. The top one was a high school self-study guide for math, physics, and chemistry. Beneath it was a thin, barefoot doctor's manual, along with a stack of neatly cut white paper bound by twine, its edges already brittle and yellowed. As her fingertips brushed across the familiar rough paper, her heart felt as if it were being squeezed by an icy hand. In her previous life, late at night in the kitchen, mocked by Evelyn and ignored by Evander in that freezing room of the military compounder room that supposedly belonged to the battalion commander's wife, but felt more like a servant's quarters, these old books and secretly hidden notebooks had been her only comfort and breath of life. She had yearned so deeply to be like the female doctors in those books, wearing a white coat and establishing a career through her own abilities. But that fragile flame had ultimately been completely suffocated by her status as a housewife of the Mercer family, by Evelyn's endless bullying, and by Evander's repeated words of just stay at home and be understanding. Wedged between the pages of the books was an old photograph the size of a palm. In the picture, a young girl wearing a faded blue cotton shirt with 2 pitch-black braids stood beneath an old locust tree at the county high school. Her smile was shy yet bright, her eyes brimming with dreams for the future. That was 17-year-old Vesper, who had just received her high school admission letter. On the back of the photo were 2 lines written with a fountain pen, the handwriting elegant yet deeply indented into the paper. Knowledge changes destiny. Vesper, you must step out into the world. Tears welled up without warning. Large drops fell onto the yellowed photograph, spreading into dark water stains. Step out into the world. Step out into the world. She hadn't been able to walk that path in her previous life, but in this life, even if she had to crawl, she would crawl her way out. Vesper clutched the photo tightly to her chest. The cold tears flowed into the corners of her mouth, bitter and astringent, yet they felt like a powerful stream of water finally injected into a parched land. That evening, while Wyatt was eating a dinner of beef and pickled vegetables, she pointed at the old books on the table. Her voice was calm but carried an unshakable strength. I dug these old books out. I want to study. Wyatt paused, looking at the worn books in front of her. Wyatt looked at Vesper's pale but unusually resolute face. A complex light flashed in his bloodshot eyes. He didn't ask why. He just nodded firmly, stuffed the last piece of beef into his mouth, and said, "All right. Tomorrow I'll wipe the table spotless for you." The difficulty of reviewing exceeded her imagination. Her body hadn't fully recovered. Sitting for too long caused a dull ache in her lower abdomen. The conditions at the textile factory's residential quarters were basic. The voltage was unstable, and the dim yellow light bulb flickered occasionally. In the freezing winter, there was only one coal stove to heat the room. Sitting at the desk to study left her hands and feet numb from the cold, and she could only rely on a hot water bottle placed on her knees for warmth. The knowledge itself was frighteningly unfamiliar. High school algebra formulas, chemical equations, and physics theorems eroded over a dozen years in her previous life had blurred into a chaotic mess. Opening the books, the once familiar symbols and letters seemed strange and dry, but Vesper had no way back. The firelight illuminated the open book and her serious profile. The pencil tips scratched against the rough scratch paper, calculating over and over, negating and overturning. When she hit a bottleneck, her brows furrowed tightly, her lips pressed together until they turned white, and she pushed through late into the night. When she was too tired, she splashed her face with cold water or pinched her own thigh. Wyatt didn't understand these things, but he silently supported her. He asked someone to borrow old reference books from the factory library. He unraveled his factory work gloves to knit her a pair of fingerless woolen gloves. He saved his cigarette money and occasionally went to the black market to trade for a small packet of white sugar, mixing it with water for her to drink while she studied, calling it brain food. Time passed amidst the scratching of the pencil and the howling of the north wind outside the window, quietly transitioning from winter to spring. The scorching month of July arrived, and with it, the day of the college entrance exam. The exam site was located at the City First High School. Wyatt specifically took a day off. Waking up at the crack of dawn, he used his old bicycle to carry her, pedaling for over 10 miles. Wearing his best, though faded blue work coveralls, he stood silently like a mountain guarding outside the exam room under the sweltering shade of the trees. When the bell signaling the end of the final subject rang, Vesper followed the crowd out of the exam room. The glaring sunlight made it hard to open her eyes. Wyatt immediately rushed over to greet her. His tanned, sweat-drenched face was filled with tension. "Vesper, how was it? Are you tired? Did you do okay?" She looked at the sweat-soaked wrinkles on his forehead and looked into his eyes, which were filled with pure, untainted concern and anxiety. The nerves that she had kept taut for days suddenly relaxed. An immense exhaustion and an indescribable pang of sorrow surged in her heart. She shook her head slightly, her voice hoarse from not speaking for a long time, laced with a hint of a choke. "Wyatt, I did my best." The rest was a long, agonizing wait. One early August day, the incessant cries of the cicadas made people restless. Vesper was sitting on a small stool by the door, relying on the daylight to read the frayed barefoot doctor's manual. Suddenly, Wyatt rushed in from outside like a gust of wind. He ran up, drenched in sweat, his hand tightly gripping a pale yellow envelope, his facial muscles twisted from extreme excitement, and his voice broke, trembling so much he could barely form words. "Vesper, the letter is here. It has a bright red stamp from the capital. It's a letter from the capital." Vesper's heart seemed to skip a beat, then immediately started pounding frantically, hitting her chest with a sharp ache. She sprang to her feet. The manual fell to the ground with a thud. Wyatt rushed up to her, stuffing the envelope into her hands. His rough fingers trembled as he pointed at the bright red stamp in the bottom right corner of the envelope. Look! Capital Medical University, Clinical Medicine Department. It's an admission letter, Vesper. My good sister, you passed. You got in." The pale yellow envelope felt heavy. Printed solemnly on it was the university's crest, and the bold words, Capital Medical University. The fiery red words, admission notice, and the stamp in the bottom right corner burned her fingertips like a scorching flame, making her tremble so much she could barely hold the thin envelope. She took a deep breath, using every ounce of her strength to tear open the envelope. She pulled out the notice, which also bore the crest and bright red text inside, Student Vesper. After review, you have been accepted into the clinical medicine department of our university. The words that followed blurred and swayed in her vision. A massive surge of scorching heat rushed straight to the top of her head, engulfing all her senses in an instant. In her ears were Wyatt's incoherent, excited shouts and the thunderous beating of her own heart. Everything before her eyes began to spin. The sunlight became incredibly blind, the howling wind from being pushed off the building in her past life, the bowl of brown sugar water Evander had brought her in the hospital, Evelyn's fake tears, the sight of her brother extending his rough hands, the scratching sound of her numb fingers calculating on scratch paper late on freezing winter nights. Countless fragmented memories flew by and collided before her eyes. Wyatt, she opened her mouth to say something, but it felt as if a red-hot iron rod was blocking her throat, preventing her from uttering a single sound. The cold pillar of hatred and resentment that had supported her for an entire year completely collapsed at this moment. Her vision went dark, and the world spun. Vesper. Her last moment before losing consciousness was Wyatt's panic scream and his warm, sturdy embrace, smelling strongly of sweat and machine oil. In the provincial capital, the military district auditorium was brightly lit, illuminating the interior as if it were broad daylight. A giant red banner hung above the stage, warmly celebrating the commendation conference and the resounding success of the 20th Military District Summer Military Competition. Below the stage sat a packed audience of military officers in crisp uniforms, wearing their respective rank insignias, their expressions solemn and proud. Evander sat right in the center of the front row, the star on his epaulet sparkling under the lights. As the battalion commander of the armored battalion, which had achieved outstanding results in the competition, he had just received his medal and certificate for a third-class individual merit from the commander. Amidst thunderous applause and flashing cameras, he stood up and delivered a standard military salute to the entire auditorium. His posture was as straight as a pine tree, his face bearing the steady, restrained glory typical of a soldier. As the conference drew to a close, the atmosphere became more relaxed. An officer from the military district's propaganda department came over with a stack of fresh newspapers, smiling as he distributed them to the top leaders. Commanders, commissars, the new provincial newspaper is here. The front page features great news for our province. The old political commissar laughed heartily as he took the newspaper and unfolded it. Out of habit, his eyes skimmed the prominent headline on the front page. The smile on his face paused slightly, then morphed into unconcealed surprise and admiration. "Oh, this is impressive. Our province's top scorer in the science track this year has been revealed. Ha! And it's a young woman. Such a high total score? Incredible. Truly incredible. And it's for Capital Medical University. A future angel in white. Right here." The old commissar's voice boomed, carrying genuine admiration. His words immediately attracted the attention of the surrounding commanders, who leaned in to take a look one after another. "Really? Let me see. Vesper. This name sounds familiar," a bespectacled deputy commander noted. Vesper? Political Commissar Arthur Reed, sitting next to Evander, subconsciously repeated the name. Then, Suddenly remembering something, his expression turned peculiar, and he shot a quick, sideways glance at Evander. Evander had been immersed in the joy of his merit award and the relaxed atmosphere as the conference neared its end. Hearing the name Vesper, his heart felt as if an invisible hand had violently squeezed it. Impossible. It's just someone with the same name. She's a housewife who hasn't even finished middle school. How could it be? He almost forced himself to maintain an outwardly calm composure, but his gaze uncontrollably carried an unconcealable urgency as he looked toward the newspaper in the old commissar's hand. On the front page of the provincial newspaper, a slightly blurry black and white photograph occupied a prominent position. The young woman in the picture was wearing a faded, small floral print shirt, her hair tied in a simple ponytail. Her facial features were delicate, yet sharply defined. Her calm gaze stared straight into the camera lens, the corners of her mouth carrying a serene expression that seemed to pierce through the dust of time. Beneath the photograph was a bold, striking black headline, "A heroine from humble beginnings. Our province's top science scorer, Vesper, admitted to Capital Medical University with outstanding results." The subheadline read, "A female textile factory worker reborn from adversity, taking up a pen to write a new chapter for her destiny. Vesper." It really was her. Evander's entire body seemed to freeze instantly. The joy of his merit and the glory of the conference were like a fragile glass cage, shattered to pieces by this unexpected blow. He stared fixedly at the black and white photo, looking into those unfamiliar, tranquil eyes. That face bore the features he knew so well, yet it was so foreign, having shed all the timid obedience from his memories, leaving only a rock-solid resilience and an icy detachment. Female textile factory worker. Reborn from adversity. Top science scorer. Capital Medical University. Every single phrase was like a sledgehammer, smashing heavily into his perception. The Vesper whom he had once demanded be understanding of others. The Vesper he thought couldn't survive if she left him. The Vesper he had repeatedly allowed Evelyn to bully, who had finally adamantly demanded a divorce from her hospital bed. A massive sense of absurdity and an indescribable panic washed over him like a freezing tide, engulfing him in an instant. He felt as if his breathing had stopped. The laughter, talking, and applause of the commanders around him sounded as if they were separated by a thick pane of frosted glass, becoming blurred and distant. Only the calm face on the newspaper and those cold, lead-type words were clearly branded onto his retinas, burning his nerves. The commendation conference concluded amidst heroic military music. The officers congratulated each other, leaving the auditorium in groups. The atmosphere was incredibly lively. Evander stood there like a soulless statue, stubbornly rooted to his seat. His hand tightly gripped the third-class merit certificate, his knuckles turning stark white from the pressure, the edges of the certificate crumpled from his grip. That provincial newspaper had been quietly slipped into his hands by Political Commissar Reed. "Battalion Commander Mercer." Arthur's voice sounded by his ear, carrying a deeply complex sigh. Evander snapped back to reality. His throat was so dry he couldn't utter a single syllable. He stood up awkwardly, grabbed the newspaper, and, forgetting even to salute or say goodbye, stumbled his way out of the noisy auditorium. Outside, the summer night wind blew against him, carrying the lingering heat of the day. But he couldn't feel a trace of warmth. He only felt a bone-chilling cold. He didn't know how he made it back to the barracks, nor how he ended up sitting at his cold desk, his hands trembling as he dialed the public telephone number of the textile factory's residential quarters over and over again. The long, drawn-out dialing tone felt like a dull knife scraping against his flesh. Finally, after an unknown number of attempts, the call connected. A gruff male voice, thick with a heavy local accent, rang out. "Hello, who are you looking for?" "I'm looking for Vesper." "Vesper from the textile factory." Evander's voice was hoarse and urgent. "Vesper?" The person on the other end paused for a moment. "Oh, the Vesper who got into college? She's been gone for a while. She's a phoenix soaring to new heights now. She went to the capital to study. Left a few days ago." Clatter. The receiver slipped from Evander's hand, slamming heavily onto the desk. The Capital Medical University. The newspaper bearing her photograph felt like a red-hot branding iron, burning his chest. The person he had so easily abandoned, the person he thought would forever stand in place waiting for him, had flown away without looking back, flown to a height he could not reach, nor even fathom. A massive, unprecedented sense of emptiness and panic washed over him, as if the solid ground beneath his feet had collapsed in an instant, revealing a bottomless abyss. No, he abruptly stood up, a near-stubborn madness surging in his eyes. He couldn't lose her like this. He had to go find her and bring her back. She must just be throwing a fit. Deep down, she must still care for him. This thought, like a life-saving straw, instantly seized all of his reason. A leave request was submitted at lightning speed with an incredibly flimsy excuse. Regimental Political Commissar Arthur Reed looked at his highly capable officer standing before Jaime's bloodshot, demeanor unstable. He hesitated to speak, but ultimately sighed and signed the form. 2 days later, after a long and grueling journey, Evander stood before the solemn and historic gates of Capital Medical University. He had taken off his military uniform and wore a slightly faded, gray-tailored suit, trying to make himself less conspicuous. However, his ramrod-straight military posture and unconcealable, icy aura still seemed completely out of place in the highly academic environment surrounding him. He clenched his fists, his palms slick with cold sweat. A carefully folded copy of the newspaper was tucked into his breast pocket close to his chest, burning his heart like a piece of hot iron. He played out the scenario of seeing Vesper again over and over in his mind. He silently rehearsed his apologies, even figuring out how to explain that he shouldn't have believed the rumors, how to explain the situation with Evelyn, and how to promise her a better future. Time ticked by second, in agonizing anticipation. The sunset painted a golden rim on the historic campus gates, casting Evander's solitary shadow long across the ground. Finally, just as the last ray of sunlight was about to sink below the horizon, a few figures walked out of the school gates. A tall, slender silhouette, wearing a simple white button-down shirt and dark blue slacks, with a canvas satchel slung over her shoulder, was tilting her head, chatting softly with a middle-aged, bespectacled man beside her who exuded a strong, scholarly aura. It was Vesper. Evander's heart leaped into his throat. Almost instinctively, he straightened his back and took a step forward, ready to call out the name that had rolled off his tongue thousands of times. However, the next second, he got a clear look at Vesper's face. Under the soft, yellow glow of the streetlights, her face was much more refined, having shed the last traces of the naivete he remembered. Her features had become distinct yet gentle. Her fair complexion carried the scholarly air of someone who hadn't been exposed to the sun for a long time. What shocked him the most was her gaze, tranquil and profound, like a rippleless lake in autumn. There was no surprise or resentment as he had imagined. There wasn't even the slightest ripple. She looked at him as if looking at a tree by the side of the road, a stone, a complete stranger. She was tilting her head, listening attentively to the middle-aged scholar beside her, the corners of her lips even carrying a faint, polite, and focused smile. That calm, composed posture was something Evander had never seen in her. It was as if her entire spirit was immersed in a world that he completely could not understand, nor could he reach. A bone-chilling cold shot up from the soles of his feet through his entire body, shattering every scenario he had prepared. Vesper. He called her name in a hoarse voice almost instinctively, the dry sound carrying an urgency and panic that he himself didn't realize. Under the halo of the streetlight, Vesper's footsteps paused. She turned her head toward the voice. The yellowish light cast a faint shadow on her face, clearly reflecting her expression, calm, with only a bottomless tranquility. Those eyes that used to be filled entirely with his reflection now clearly mirrored Evander's weather-beaten, somewhat wretched figure, yet they didn't ripple in the slightest. The bespectacled scholar beside her also stopped, looking at Evander with confusion, then looking back at Vesper. Evander was stared at by those still, rippleless eyes to the point of panic. He subconsciously puffed out his chest, trying to regain a sense of control. His Adam's apple bobbed with difficulty. His voice was low and urgent, carrying an undeniable commanding tone, yet revealing a poorly concealed tremble. "Come home with me." Under the yellowish streetlight, Evander's shadow was stretched long and cast upon the mottled ground. The old gray-tailored suit couldn't hide the ramrod straight back of a soldier, but his shoulders seemed to be weighed down by an invisible burden. He stood before the school gates like a sudden boundary marker, abruptly blocking the path leading to the sanctuary of knowledge. "Come home with me." Those hoarse, urgent words encompassed the exhaustion of a long journey across thousands of miles, but also carried the domineering habit ingrained in his very bones. It was as if this was merely the finale of a play. Since he had come, she should drop everything and obediently follow him. Vesper's footsteps only paused for a moment. Even the expression on her face didn't show a single crack. Her deep, pool-like eyes clearly reflected Evander's figure, but it was just like looking at a stone by the roadside, incapable of stirring up even a single ripple. She didn't even bother to look at the callus-covered hand he was holding out. Her calm gaze swept past him as if he were merely thin air. Then, very naturally, she leaned slightly toward the bespectacled, middle-aged scholar with an elegant aura standing beside her. Her voice wasn't loud but clear and steady, carrying absolute focus and a perfect degree of politeness. Professor Chambers, regarding the critical value in the serum separation of the control group from the experiment you mentioned last night, I cross-referenced the previous datasets and found that the third and seventh groups seem to have a slight time variance variable, which could potentially impact the significance of the results. The data notebook is in my bag. Should we go back to the lab to cross-check it right now, or should I compile and summarize it and leave it on your desk tomorrow morning? Her speaking pace was steady, her pronunciation clear. The specialized terminology she mentioned left Evander completely baffled. That immersive focus, the natural truth-seeking attitude revealed when facing her professor, created the most cruel contrast with her cold indifference toward him. Professor Chambers was clearly quite surprised by this sudden command to come home, but he was quickly drawn in by the professional issue Vesper had brought up. Pushing up his glasses, a flash of admiration passed through his eyes. Oh, a time variance variable? You observed that very carefully, Vesper. Right now, he subconsciously looked at his wristwatch, then glanced at Evander, who was standing frozen under the streetlight with an ashen face. He seemed to feel a bit awkward. It's getting a bit late now. The laboratory building over there. Data doesn't wait for anyone, Professor. Vesper's voice remained calm, but it carried an undeniable persistence. Especially minuscule variables like this, which can directly affect the reliability of the entire experimental model. I can finish compiling the preliminary analysis tonight. As she spoke, she reached out and unzipped her canvas bag, making a show of taking out the notebook inside. She completely ignored Evander's existence, treating him like an obstructive block of air. A surge of fury at being utterly despised and the agony of being torn apart by a massive panic acted like two venomous snakes, instantly constricting Evander's heart. He looked at Vesper, completely and wholeheartedly immersed in her academic problem, too stingy to spare him even a single glance. He looked at the focused expression she reserved for that professor. Her gentle, enduring face from her past life and her bone-chillingly cold face right now were tearing his mind apart. Vesper. Evander took a heavy step forward. His tall, imposing figure exuded an intense pressure, nearly blocking the path of the two. He stared at her with bloodshot eyes. His voice was hoarse and distorted from extreme emotion, carrying the desperate struggle on the verge of losing control and the last bit of remaining stubbornness. I am talking to you. Come home with me. Whatever it is, we can talk about it when we get home. He had finally torn away his facade of fake calmness, revealing his inner volatility and a barely concealed hint of begging. Vesper finally truly looked at him. That gaze was so tranquil it made one's heart run cold. She frowned slightly, as if pondering over an insignificant obstacle. Then she spoke with extreme indifference. Her voice wasn't loud, but like a thin, ice-soaked blade, it sliced through the sallow night. Comrade Battalion Commander. She even used the title that once represented his glory, but now only held a detached mockery. Please get out of the way. She leaned slightly, her arm moving in an incredibly natural, protective gesture as she gently supported the arm of Professor Chambers, who was looking a bit flustered beside her. The movement was fluid and polite. I am in a hurry to process the experimental data. The moment she finished speaking, she didn't bother to give Evander another look, as if he were just an unimportant obstacle by the roadside. Supporting Professor Chambers, the two of them naturally bypassed his stubborn figure and walked unhurriedly toward the brightly lit laboratory building. The crisp, steady clicking of her shoes against the ground sounded like cold drum beats, hammering forcefully into Evander's already shattered heart. She was gone, right in front of him, holding another man's arm, all for some damn experimental data, leaving without looking back. The massive panic of being utterly abandoned and the frenzied rage of having all his pride trampled over engulfed Evander like a tsunami in an instant. The dam of his reason completely collapsed. Vesper, stop right there! He let out a beast-like growl. In his bloodshot eyes, only that resolute back remained. His body reacted before his brain even could. Like a crazed panther, he lunged forward fiercely, reaching out to grab Vesper's arm. He couldn't let her go. He had to bring her back. At the exact moment his calloused fingers were about to touch Vesper's arm, Vesper, as if she had eyes in the back of her head, didn't halt her steps at all, nor did she even turn her head. The hand that had been supporting Professor Chambers naturally dropped and reached into the side pocket of her canvas bag. Then, with a slight flick of her wrist, an object traced a brief, cold silver arc under the yellowish streetlight. With a faint swish through the air, it flew straight toward Evander's face. Evander instinctively reached out and caught it. It felt cold and rigid in his hand, carrying the distinct heaviness of metal. He unconsciously opened his palm, The yellowish streetlight clearly illuminated the item resting in his hand, a Hero brand fountain pen. The barrel featured the familiar olive green lacquer. Due to years of use, the gold plating on the cap had worn off, revealing the dull brass underneath. Engraved on the clip were the tiny initials EM, the abbreviation of his name. This was the gift personally given to him by the regimental commander after he earned his merit on the Laoshan front years ago. He used to treasure it immensely. Later, it seemed it was after an argument. A red-eyed Vesper had demanded to keep it, saying it was for a keepsake. And now, this old fountain pen, carrying the bygone years and the memories he once thought were theirs, had been thrown back at him like a piece of trash. The cold metal rubbed against his palm, chilling him to the bone. Evander was struck dumb, frozen in place as if bound by a spell. Every movement, every roar, all his fury and panic were completely frozen at this exact moment. He glued his bloodshot eyes to the worn, old fountain pen in his palm, as if seeing its true shape clearly for the very first time. The worn gold plating and the dull lacquer acted like a cruel mirror, starkly reflecting his conceited past and his pathetic present. In his ears, the sound of Vesper's footsteps as she supported Professor Chambers away had faded into the brilliant lights of the laboratory building. Only he remained, standing utterly alone under the sallow streetlight at the campus gates, like a laughingstock abandoned by the world. The night wind blew past, sweeping up a few dry leaves with a soft rustling sound. Evander slowly, incredibly slowly, closed his hand. The cold, old fountain pen dug deep into his flesh, aching all the way to his soul. He lowered his head, staring at the cold, metallic gleam reflecting in his palm. The streetlight nailed his long, solitary shadow onto the cold concrete, like a stone statue gradually weathering away. That cold Hero fountain pen felt like a red-hot bullet tightly piercing Evander's hand. The yellowish light blurred the scratches on the barrel, but it burned the two letters EM deeply into his retinas, so hot that it made his eyes sting. Vesper, he wanted to scream, to demand answers, to lunge forward and grab that resolute silhouette that had vanished into the light of the lab building. But his throat felt as if it were blocked by sandpaper, only able to produce broken, wheezing sounds. His outstretched hand hung stiffly in midair. His fingertips still harbored the empty sensation of brushing past her sleeve, a bone-deep chill. The brightly lit glass windows of the laboratory building were like cold eyes, reflecting his pathetic state. At this moment, he was merely an insignificant obstacle completely exiled from her world. Passing students cast curious and guarded glances at him. Their whispering chatter felt like sharp needles, piercing the military pride he had once boasted of. Please get out of the way. I am in a hurry to process the experimental data. That cruelly indifferent voice kept echoing in his ears. There was no hysteria, no resentment, and no tearful complaints. There was only a cold indifference that had entirely erased him from her life. She couldn't even be bothered to waste a single ounce of emotion on him. A massive, unprecedented panic suffocated Evander's heart, far more terrifying than facing a hail of bullets. Only at this moment did he truly realize that the Vesper who used to obediently wait for him in the residential compound, who used to cook and wash dishes for him, who was constantly demanded by him to be understanding of everyone, was truly dead. She had died on that cold operating table, died in the bowl of fake brown sugar water he had brought her with his own hands, and died beneath the tall building that Evelyn had pushed her from. The person living now was Vesper of Capital Medical University, the top science scorer, Vesper. In her world, there was only cold experimental data, serious academic discussions, and a future that he completely could not understand, let alone touch. As for him, Evander, a young battalion commander who had just earned a third-class merit with a boundless future ahead, standing in front of her, and that Professor Chambers in the brilliant world she was heading toward had become nothing more than a joke. A suppressed, ragged gasp, like a dying beast, escaped from deep within his chest. He clenched his fists tightly. The hard cap of the old pen dug deep into the flesh of his palm, bringing a sharp ache. Strangely enough, this pain managed to suppress the shattering despair surging in his heart. He couldn't collapse here. He couldn't look as pathetic as an abandoned man in front of the gates of this sacred institution. Evander forced himself to straighten his slightly hunched back. The will of a soldier etched into his bones kicked in at this moment, even if that will was merely like a candle in the wind. Slowly, incredibly stiffly, he turned around. Lifting legs as heavy as lead, he took heavy steps, one by one, leaving the pool of streetlight that chilled him to the bone. Every step felt like walking on hot coals. The brilliant light of the laboratory building behind his back was the blinding light of an entirely different world. Capital Medical University, female dormitory. Under the yellowish light of a desk lamp, Vesper opened a thick pathophysiology textbook. The dense notes crammed onto the pages were her weapons against forgetting and time. The tip of her pen scratched calmly and focused across the paper. The dorm room was very quiet, with only the soft rustling of her roommate turning pages. Mia, an outgoing local girl with a ponytail in the opposite bed, popped her head over and whispered, "Earlier downstairs, that fierce-looking guy in the tailored suit, was he looking for you? Do you know him?" Vesper didn't stop her pen. Her eyes remained fixed on a complex pathological mechanism diagram. Her tone was flat and rippleless, as if stating a fact that had absolutely nothing to do with her. An unimportant acquaintance. An acquaintance? Mia grew even more curious. He looked like military, didn't he? That intimidating aura looked like he wanted to eat someone alive. Vesper finally looked up. The yellowish light cast a faint shadow over her delicate face. The corners of her lips curled up slightly. In that smile, there was no warmth, only the indifference of having seen through the ways of the world, and a barely noticeable hint of mockery. "Yeah, he used to be a soldier." She paused, her gaze sweeping past the thick darkness outside the window, and added, her voice as light as a falling feather, "A soldier who is used to giving orders." She didn't say another word, lowering her head to immerse herself once again in the world of books. It was as if the encounter at the school gates moments ago, which was enough to completely destroy a proud man's self-esteem, was merely a light breeze brushing over the surface of the water, leaving not a single ripple behind. Her roommate looked at her tranquil face and suddenly felt an inexplicable chill. She shrank back, taking the hint, and asked no more questions. At the military compound, inside Evander's quarters, the room reeked of cigarette smoke. The curtains were drawn tight, completely shutting out the light from outside. Evander hadn't turned on the lights. He just sat leaning against the cold wall. Scattered at his feet were several half-smoked cigarette butts, their glowing red embers flickering in the dark. He clutched the hero fountain pen tightly in his hand, his knuckles stark white from the excessive force. The cold metal had been warmed by his body heat, yet it still couldn't dispel the bone-deep chill in his heart. "Vesper, Vesper." He unconsciously muttered her name, his voice hoarse and dry. Flashing incessantly before his eyes was her resolute gaze when she ripped out the IV drip on the hospital bed and slammed down the divorce papers. He saw her indifference when she supported the professor away, tossing out the words, "Please get out of the way," in front of the school gates. He saw the calm, unfamiliar face on the newspaper, along with those glaring words, "Top science scorer, Capital Medical University." He was wrong. Irredeemably wrong. Wrong to the point of no return. The so-called understanding, the bigger picture, the widow and orphan who didn't have it easy, all of it was merely a veil covering his own cowardice, bias, and vain pride. With his own hands, through those repeated demands for understanding, he had pushed the woman who once considered him her everything into a freezing abyss. And with his own hands, he had extinguished her last ray of light. He used to think she couldn't survive without him. As it turned out, he was the one who couldn't live without her, unable to find even a place for his soul to return to. Thud. A dull sound echoed as his fist slammed hard into the rigid concrete floor. A bone-deep pain shot through his knuckles, but it was nothing compared to the agony in his heart. In the darkness, Evander's bloodshot eyes stared fixedly into the void. Swirling within them were waves of regret, intertwined with the fury of being completely denied and discarded. Ultimately, it all settled into a numb, deathly despair. He snatched the open bottle of hard liquor from the floor, threw his head back, and drained it. The fiery liquid burned his throat, throwing him into a violent coughing fit. Physiological tears welled up, but he didn't care. He just drank madly, as if clutching at a life-saving straw, desperately trying to use this searing pain to numb his crushed heart. An unknown amount of time passed. The empty bottle rolled onto the floor with a hollow clatter. Evander's tall frame curled up in the cold corner of the wall, his head buried deep in his arms. His shoulders shook uncontrollably. Suppressed sobs, like those of a wounded beast, echoed in the silent room. There were no tears, only broken, desperate cries tearing from his throat. At the textile factory's residential quarters, under the yellowish light, Wyatt carefully placed a crisp new money order under the glass tabletop. Beside it was a photograph of Vesper wearing a white coat, taken in front of the medical school gates. In the picture, the young woman's eyes were bright, her smile tranquil and full of inner strength. "Wyatt, my allowance came in this month, so I'm sending half of it back to you. Don't be too frugal, eat and shop like normal. Everything is going well for me here." The professor values me a lot, and even let me join an important research project. The letter bore Vesper's elegant, firm handwriting. Wyatt's rough fingers brushed over his sister's face in the photo, then touched the money order again. His bloodshot eyes shone with joy, and a simple, honest smile bloomed on his face. He stepped out the door, looked up at the pitch-black night sky, and took a deep breath. Despite the cold air thick with the smell of coal smoke, he felt his entire body brim with vitality. From the house next door came Evelyn's shrill, crying curses and the faint sound of a child wailing, interspersed with words like, ungrateful wretch, heartless, and serves you right. Ever since the news of Vesper getting into college and divorcing Evander spread, Evelyn's life hadn't been easy. The theft of the food stamps and the watch, though never taken to court, was known to everyone in the compound. The sheer weight of public gossip was enough to drown her. The Mercer family had completely cut ties with her, and even Charlie had been taken away by his grandparents. She was now truly isolated. With her reputation ruined, she could only rely on the meager wages from sweeping the streets at the factory to scrape by, her bitterness growing heavier by the day. Hearing those hysterical curses, Wyatt let out a contemptuous snort and slammed his door shut, blocking out the obnoxious noise. Inside, humming a nameless tune, he carefully scooped a bit of lard from a tin, preparing to fry himself an egg to celebrate his sister sending money back again. The firelight from the stove reflected on his honest, tanned face so warm and peaceful. In the brightly lit laboratory at Capital Medical University, Vesper, dressed in a pristine white coat, was focused on adjusting the focus of a microscope. Within her field of vision, the magnificent and rigorous microscopic world was filled with mysteries waiting to be solved. Outside the window, the cold winds of early spring in 1984 howled, but they could not extinguish the blazing fire of her passion and thirst for knowledge inside. Her journey had only just begun, and on that path, there would never again be a shadow named Evander.
The best revenge is leveling up. People might leave, but your knowledge and career never will. I hope Vesper's journey inspires you to walk away from toxicity. Tell me your favorite moment below.